The moment before you wake is one of the strangest places your mind ever visits. You are not fully dreaming, but you are not fully here. Your body is returning to the room, while your consciousness still seems to be touching something beyond it. In that fragile interval, a dream can feel closer than memory and more distant than thought. A voice, a place, or a feeling may remain for only a few seconds before waking. Life rushes in and seals the door. Science calls this a transition state, but anyone who is awakened slowly from a powerful dream knows it can feel like standing at the edge of two worlds. Tonight, we will explore what happens right before you wake and why that threshold may reveal something profound about dreams, memory, consciousness, and the reality your mind returns to every morning. Welcome. If you are here right now, if you found this video in the quiet of a late night or the soft gray of an early morning, then something in you is already standing near that threshold. Something in you recognized the question before the answer was offered. And that recognition is exactly where this journey begins. This channel exists for moments like this one, for the in-between hours, the restless minds, the curious souls who lie in the dark and wonder about the nature of what they experience when the world goes quiet and the dreaming begins. You are not alone in that wondering. There are many of us here, spread across the world, listening in the stillness. If this kind of quiet exploration helps you think, helps you rest, or simply makes you feel a little less alone in the mystery of being conscious, consider subscribing to the Midnight Mind. This channel returns again and again to the deep questions, the ones that science has not quite finished answering and perhaps never will. Every episode is an invitation into that unfinished territory, approached slowly and without fear. And before we go further, leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you are listening from right now. Tell us what time it is in your corner of reality. Whether it is 3 in the morning and the room is perfectly dark, or just past midnight and the city is still humming faintly outside your window, your moment matters. Your threshold is real. We would love to know where you are entering this from tonight. Here is what this exploration will offer you, and here is what it will not pretend to offer. We will move through the science of waking, through what researchers have genuinely discovered about the transition from sleep to consciousness. We will look at what happens in the brain, in the body, and in the mind as the dream world slowly releases you each morning. That science is real, and it is quietly astonishing. We will also move beyond what is fully proven. There are questions at the edge of sleep science that remain genuinely open, and we will enter those questions honestly. Some of what we explore tonight will be careful interpretation. Some of it will be reasonable speculation. Some of it will be the kind of wondering that sits at the border between science and philosophy, where the most interesting territory often lives. What we will not do is claim that the moment before waking is literal proof of parallel universes. We will not assert that your consciousness physically travels to another reality each night. The honest answer, the one worth living inside, is that we do not know everything about what happens in that threshold. And the not knowing, approached with curiosity rather than anxiety, turns out to be one of the most beautiful places a mind can rest. So, settle in. Let the room be what it is. Let your breathing slow a little. What follows is not a lecture and not a promise of certainty. It is an exploration, offered calmly, of one of the most intimate mysteries your mind experiences every single day of your life. You know the feeling. You have known it since childhood, even if you have never had a precise word for it. You are asleep, And then, very gradually, something begins to shift, not with a sudden jolt, not like a door slamming open, more like a tide changing direction. Slowly, almost tenderly, the dream begins to thin at its edges. A moment ago, you were somewhere. Perhaps you were in a house you have never lived in, but somehow recognized completely. Perhaps you were walking through a landscape made of memory and imagination, pressed together into something that felt entirely real. Perhaps someone was speaking to you, someone whose voice carried a weight that mattered, even if you cannot now say why. And then the room began to return. Not all at once. First, perhaps a sense of your own weight, the particular heaviness of your body lying on the mattress, a corner of awareness that knows before it fully knows that there is a ceiling above you and a floor below, and a world that is waiting to be real again. For a few seconds, you exist in both places. You are still inside the texture of the dream, still feeling its emotional weather, still carrying its images like photographs developing slowly in a dark room. And at the same time, you are beginning to feel the room, the pillow, the particular quality of light behind your closed eyes. This is the threshold. This is the hypnopompic edge, the border country between sleep and waking that researchers have documented but never fully explained. And if you have ever paused there, even briefly, you may have noticed something strange. The dream does not feel like nothing. It feels like somewhere you were actually present. The sensory quality of the fading world is not like ordinary daydreaming. It is not like remembering something you imagined. It has a density to it, a realness that ordinary waking thought simply does not carry in quite the same way. The colors were more saturated, the emotions were more direct. The logic of that world, however strange, had its own internal consistency that felt completely valid while you were inside it. And then, in only a matter of seconds, it begins to dissolve. The details go first. The face of the person you were speaking with softens and loses definition. The name of the place you were in slips sideways out of memory like water through open fingers. The feeling remains a little longer than the imagery, and then even that begins to fade as the room solidifies and the ordinary day begins to assert itself. What was that place? Where exactly were you for those long hours before the waking began? These questions feel almost too simple to ask and somehow too vast to answer. But they are worth asking slowly, and we will ask them carefully tonight. You have had this experience more times than you can count. And there is something quietly remarkable about the fact that nearly every human being who has ever lived has stood in that same threshold, has felt that same dissolution of one world and the reassembly of another. And yet the experience still manages to feel profoundly personal. It still feels like something happening specifically to you. The fading of dreams is one of the most universal human experiences, and also one of the most consistently mysterious. Studies have suggested that most people forget the vast majority of their dreams within minutes of waking, not hours, minutes. The information does not simply file itself away in a folder you can return to. It evaporates as if the waking mind and the dreaming mind use fundamentally different storage systems. Most mornings you may wake with only the faintest emotional imprint. You feel something, a residue of mood that was formed somewhere you can no longer access. You feel calm or unsettled or strangely sad or quietly joyful. And when you try to trace that feeling back to its source, you find only a faint shimmer where the dream used to be. Occasionally, something more survives. a vivid image, a fragment of dialogue, a specific sensation, the feeling of falling or flying or standing in a familiar place that does not exist anywhere in the waking world. These fragments often feel disproportionately meaningful. Not like random debris, but like signals from somewhere, like messages that arrived in a language you are still trying to translate. And then there is the brief confusion. The moment, sometimes lasting only a heartbeat, sometimes stretching for a full disoriented minute in which you are not entirely certain where you are, who you are, or what day or time it is in the world. The room is there, but you have not yet fully inhabited it. The self is there, but it is not yet fully reassembled. That moment of brief confusion, strange as it feels, is actually one of the most honest things your consciousness ever reveals about itself. It is a small crack in the ordinary certainty through which something deeper and more mysterious briefly becomes visible. There is a common assumption that waking up is instantaneous. You are asleep, and then you are awake. The mind turns off, the mind turns on. The dream ends, the day begins. But this is not actually what happens. And when you understand what is really occurring in those first moments after sleep, the experience of the threshold becomes something entirely different. Waking is not a switch. It is a reconstruction. Your brain does not simply receive a stream of sensory data from the world and accept it as reality. What it does is far more active, far more creative, and in some ways, far more strange. Your brain assembles reality from the signals it receives, comparing incoming information against stored models, generating predictions, filling gaps, and constructing a coherent experience of being somewhere, being someone, being in a specific moment in time. This construction process happens so quickly and so smoothly during ordinary waking hours that it feels like direct perception. It feels as though you simply open your eyes and see the world as it is. But in the soft, slow, gradual waking from deep sleep, the construction happens in stages. And if you are paying attention, you can sometimes feel the stages happening. First comes the body, the sense of weight, of temperature, of position. Before you know where you are, you know that you have a body, and that it is lying still, and that it is heavy and warm. Then comes the space, a growing awareness of dimensions, of the room, of the ceiling and the walls. Then comes identity, the slow, quiet reassembling of who you are, your name, your life, the particular set of continuities that make you the version of yourself who woke up today. And beneath all of that, running alongside it, is the fading dream. The other reality that your mind was inside just moments ago. And here is the question that makes the threshold so philosophically interesting. If both the dream and the waking world are assembled by the same mind, using similar creative processes, what exactly is the difference between them? The comfortable answer is that one is real and one is not. But the more carefully you examine what the brain is actually doing when it constructs experience, the more that simple boundary begins to soften, not dissolve entirely, but soften. And in that softening, the moment before you wake becomes something worth entering very slowly and very carefully. Sleep science has a name for the state you pass through right before you wake. It is called the hypnopompic state, from the Greek words for sleep and guide or conductor, as though your mind is being escorted from one realm back to the waking world. The hypnopompic state is understood to be a transitional window of consciousness, distinct from full sleep and distinct from full waking, in which the brain is actively shifting between different modes of operation. During the deepest stages of sleep, your brain produces slow electrical waves, large and rhythmic, like ocean swells moving across the surface of a calm sea. As you move toward waking, these waves begin to quicken. The electrical activity in your brain grows faster and more complex, approaching the patterns that characterize alert, awake cognition. But this transition does not happen uniformly across the brain all at once. Different regions awaken at different rates. This is part of why the hypnopompic state feels so unusual. Parts of your brain may be operating in something close to waking mode, while other parts are still generating the slower, more associative, more visually rich patterns associated with dreaming sleep. You may be partially awake and simultaneously partially inside the dream state, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a genuinely neurological one. Sleep inertia is another concept that conventional science uses to describe what happens in those first moments after waking. Sleep inertia refers to the period of reduced alertness, slowed cognition, and impaired performance that follows waking. It can last anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, and in some cases, it can persist for much longer. During sleep inertia, your brain is still completing the transition from sleep mode to waking mode, and your cognitive performance during this window is genuinely diminished. This is why alarms can feel brutal in a way that ordinary waking does not. An abrupt alarm tears you out of the transitional state before the reconstruction is complete, leaving your mind disoriented, fragmented, and slow. Whereas waking gradually and naturally allows the reconstruction to proceed at a pace that the brain finds more manageable. Dream recall, the ability to remember what you were dreaming, is also shaped by this transitional process. Memories formed during rapid eye movement sleep, the stage most associated with vivid narrative dreaming, are not encoded into long-term memory using the same pathways as waking experience. Researchers believe that the neurochemical environment of rapid eye movement sleep, which involves lower levels of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, may actively interfere with the consolidation of dream content into the kind of memory you can access later. This is why waking slowly and remaining still immediately after waking can sometimes allow more dream content to surface. Your brain is still in a chemical state closer to the dream state, and the transition has not yet fully closed the door on dream memory. Moving, speaking, or checking a phone immediately upon waking accelerates the transition and seems to erase dream content rapidly and irreversibly. Sensory reorientation is another key process happening right before you wake. As your brain moves toward consciousness, it begins receiving and prioritizing incoming sensory signals from the body and the environment. Light, sound, temperature, proprioception, the sense of where your body is in space, all of these streams of information are gradually integrated and interpreted to construct the experience of being in a specific room at a specific time. Memory integration, the process of connecting the current moment to your personal history and sense of identity, happens alongside sensory reorientation. Your brain is not simply recognizing where you are. It is remembering who you are and how this moment connects to the long story of your life. Yesterday comes back. Your name comes back. The particular weight of your life and your responsibilities and your relationships comes back gently, one by one. All of these processes, hypnopompic transition, sleep inertia, dream recall, sensory reorientation, and memory integration, are working simultaneously in the moments before you wake. And the fact that the experience often feels so smooth, so seamless, so naturally continuous, is itself a kind of quiet miracle. Your brain is building the world, and it is doing it so elegantly that the construction is almost entirely invisible. And yet the scientific description, as careful and as genuinely illuminating as it is, does not quite capture something about the experience. There is a quality to the hypnopompic threshold that the neurological account names without fully explaining. And it is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, not to dismiss the science, but to notice honestly where the description stops short of the experience. The feeling of having been somewhere. This is the part that is difficult to account for with the language of brain waves and neurotransmitters alone. Not just the feeling of having had visual and emotional experiences during sleep, but the specific feeling of return. The sense that you are coming back from somewhere rather than simply resuming. Not everyone reports this, and it is more vivid in some nights than others. But when it occurs, it has a quality that is hard to reduce to mere neurological transition. Some people describe the final moments before waking as feeling like moving through a corridor, a gentle narrowing of space, the dream world behind them, the waking world ahead, and a brief passage in between that belongs entirely to neither. The emotional tone of this passage varies. Sometimes it is peaceful, sometimes it is tinged with a kind of wistful loss, as though something beautiful is receding and cannot be held. Others describe a sense of reluctance, not sleepiness, which is something different, not fatigue, which is the body's signal, but a particular kind of consciousness that seems to want to remain in the threshold, that seems, in its quiet way, to be in no hurry to return to the waking world, as though the dreaming state offered something that ordinary waking awareness does not, and the mind is pausing at the door before agreeing to close it. There is also the quality of what is felt in those moments. The emotions that arise in the hypnopompic state are often unusually pure, unusually clear, unusually free from the complicated texture of ordinary emotional life. Grief, if it arises, can feel very clean. Joy, if it arises, can feel very simple, as though the filters and defenses and narratives that normally shape waking emotional experience have not yet fully reassembled themselves. And then there are the experiences at the edge of perception, voices heard clearly in the moment before waking, a name spoken, a phrase offered, a sound that carried meaning. These are documented phenomena, not supernatural claims, but genuine sensory experiences that occur in the hypnopompic state. The brain, in its partially assembled state, can generate perceptions that feel entirely real, entirely external, entirely present, even though they arise from within. What the classical explanation does not yet fully account for is why these experiences so consistently carry a sense of significance. Not all of them, and not always, but often enough that it feels worth noticing. Dreams themselves can feel random and strange, but the final moments before waking, the moments when the dreaming mind is still active and the waking mind is just beginning to reassemble, often feel different, more deliberate, more like arriving at something than departing from it. Science explains what is happening in the brain during this transition. What it does not yet explain is why the subjective experience of that transition carries the particular quality it does, why it so often feels like return, why it so often carries a freight of meaning that ordinary waking thought does not produce in quite the same way. These are not gaps that invalidate the science. They are places where the science is honest about its current limits, and those limits are worth dwelling in for a moment because they are exactly where the most interesting questions live. Consider what the threshold is from the inside. Your sensory connection to the waking world is only beginning to form. Your logical mind has not yet fully resumed its ordinary duties. Your memory is in a state of partial reconstruction, and your dreaming consciousness, that other mode of awareness that has been running its own deeply complex reality for hours, has not yet fully released its hold. In that particular configuration, what kind of awareness are you? You are something that does not have a clean name in ordinary language. You are not asleep. You are not awake. You are not dreaming in the full sense, and you are not perceiving in the full sense. You are, for a brief and unrepeatable moment, a consciousness between modes, and it is entirely possible that this between-mode consciousness reveals something about the nature of awareness that ordinary waking never does. Researchers who study consciousness have long noted that the mind is not a single uniform thing. It is a system of many overlapping and sometimes competing processes. Attention, perception, memory, emotion, identity, language. All of these are distinct operations that are coordinated into the experience of being a unified self. That coordination is so reliable in ordinary waking life that the seams are invisible. But in the hypnopompic threshold, some of those seams become briefly, gently visible. The identity coordination, for example, takes a moment to reassemble. There is a brief window in which you are aware, in which there is clearly something it is like to be you in this moment, and yet the full architecture of who you are has not yet clicked into place. You have not yet become the version of yourself with a name and a history and a schedule for the day. You are just awareness, lying in a dark room, holding the last wisps of somewhere else. What if that state, awareness without its usual architecture, is not actually a broken or transitional form of consciousness? What if it is, in its own right, a different but valid mode of experiencing? The ancient traditions of many cultures distinguished between different states of consciousness and gave each its own name, its own significance, and its own wisdom. The modern scientific framework tends to treat the threshold as noise between two more important signals, but perhaps the threshold is its own signal entirely. This is where we begin to move from description into deeper territory. Not abandoning the science, but moving past where the science currently ends into the space where observation gives way to genuine wonder. And it is from that place that the most interesting questions about your mind, your dreams, and the reality you return to every morning begin to take their truest shape. Sleep science, as a formal discipline, is surprisingly young. While philosophers and physicians have speculated about sleep and dreams for thousands of years, the rigorous scientific study of what happens inside a sleeping mind only became possible in the middle of the 20th century, when researchers developed the tools to observe brain activity during sleep in real time. What they discovered in those early years was so unexpected that it fundamentally changed what scientists believed the sleeping brain was doing. Before the discovery of rapid eye movement sleep in the early 1950s, the prevailing assumption was that the brain essentially went quiet during sleep. It was understood as a passive rest state, a kind of biological shutdown, The discovery that the brain entered a phase of intense electrical activity during sleep, a phase closely resembling the patterns of alert waking consciousness, was genuinely startling. The sleeping brain was not resting. In certain periods, it was nearly as active as it was during full waking. Rapid eye movement sleep, which occurs in cycles throughout the night, is the stage most strongly associated with vivid, narrative dreaming. During rapid eye movement sleep, the electrical patterns of the brain shift dramatically. The slow waves of deep sleep are replaced by fast, complex, irregular patterns that neuroscientists sometimes call desynchronized. These patterns look remarkably like the brain of a person who is awake and engaged, and yet the body is in a state of deep muscular paralysis, almost entirely disconnected from voluntary movement. This disconnect, an intensely active brain inside a paralyzed body, is itself one of the most fascinating design features of human sleep. The body is kept still so that the mind can run its most complex programs without physical consequence. And the programs that the mind runs during this time are vivid, emotionally rich, spatially complex, and often narratively coherent within their own internal logic. What happens as you approach waking from a period of rapid eye movement sleep? The electrical patterns of the brain do not simply switch off and switch on. They undergo a gradual modulation, a kind of retuning. The frequency of brain waves shifts in stages. Certain networks of neurons that were dominant during dreaming begin to quiet, while others that are associated with self-referential thinking, planning, and sensory integration begin to reactivate. The default mode network, a large-scale system of brain regions associated with self-reflection, autobiographical memory, and mental simulation, is particularly interesting in this context. This network is active both during certain phases of dreaming and during waking self-reflection. Some researchers have suggested that the dreaming mind and the reflective waking mind may share more neural architecture than was previously assumed, which raises interesting questions about the continuity of the self across sleep and waking. Memory formation during sleep has become one of the most active areas of research in neuroscience over recent decades. It is now understood that sleep plays a critical role not merely in storing memories formed during the day, but in processing them. During sleep, the brain replays recent experiences, identifies patterns, integrates new information with older knowledge, and sometimes restructures understanding in ways that can feel upon waking, like sudden clarity or insight. The specific chemistry of rapid eye movement sleep is also worth noting. During this stage, levels of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter associated with attention and memory, are relatively high, which may contribute to the vividness and complexity of dream experience. Meanwhile, levels of serotonin and norepinephrine, which are associated with logical, critical, and reality-testing functions of cognition, are reduced. This chemistry may be why dream logic feels so entirely valid inside the dream, even when it would be obviously strange from a waking perspective. There is also the question of consciousness itself during this transition. Consciousness, in the strict scientific sense, remains deeply understood in terms of its neural correlates, but deeply mysterious in terms of its fundamental nature. We can identify which brain regions and which electrical patterns are associated with conscious experience. We cannot yet fully explain why any physical brain activity gives rise to subjective experience at all. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains genuinely unsolved. In the hypnopompic window, this hard problem becomes personally immediate. You are clearly experiencing something in that threshold state. There is something it is like to be you in those final moments before waking. And yet the full infrastructure of your waking consciousness has not yet reassembled, which raises a question that science is only beginning to seriously address. Is there a continuous thread of awareness that runs through all of these states, dreaming, hypnopompic, and waking? Or does consciousness flicker in and out, reassembling fresh each time? The leading models of consciousness, including global workspace theory, predictive processing frameworks, and integrated information theory, each offer a different answer to this question. And none of them agrees completely. The field is genuinely open. The debate is active and honest. And the person lying quietly in bed in the final moments before waking is, without quite realizing it, at the center of one of the most unresolved questions in contemporary science. The research on sleep transitions also touches on something called micro-awakenings. Throughout a night of sleep, the brain briefly touches the surface of waking consciousness many times, often without your awareness of it. These micro-awakenings are so brief and so seamlessly reintegrated into the broader sleep cycle that you typically have no memory of them in the morning. But they suggest that the threshold between sleeping and waking consciousness is not as fixed or as binary as ordinary experience makes it seem. What all of this research points toward, carefully and without overstatement, is that the mind's movement through sleep states is a continuous, dynamic, richly complex process. The final waking, the long, slow rise from dreaming to full awareness, is the most visible and consciously accessible portion of this process. And what happens in that final rise is genuinely worth understanding. Imagine your waking reality as something that must be built, not simply received. Not a passive input that pours through your senses and assembles itself automatically, but an active construction that your brain undertakes every single morning, pulling together threads of sensory data, memory, spatial reasoning, bodily awareness, and identity into the coherent, seamless experience of being alive and awake in a specific place at a specific time. That construction is what is happening right before you wake, and it is, in its own quiet way, remarkable. The first thing your brain does as waking begins is re-establish your body. Before you know what day it is, before you know what city you are in, before you know your own name with full certainty, your brain is mapping your physical self. It is receiving signals from your muscles and joints and skin about the orientation and temperature and weight of the body lying in the bed. It is reintegrating the sense of physical selfhood that was largely suspended during deep sleep. This embodiment happens before cognition in the conventional sense. It is pre-verbal, pre-narrative, pre-rational. It is the most fundamental layer of the self being restored first, the animal awareness of having a body in a space, and for a brief moment, this is all you are. Awareness of having a body, warmth, weight, and the softness of bed beneath you. Everything else is still assembling. Next comes space. The brain begins to locate the body in its physical environment. Signals of light and sound are interpreted. The particular acoustic quality of your bedroom, the specific angle of light through a window, the faint sounds of morning or night. All of these are processed and compared against stored spatial memory to identify where you are. If you wake in an unfamiliar place, this spatial reorientation can take noticeably longer, and the experience of brief disorientation is simply the brain still running the search. Simultaneously, the brain is managing the dissolution of the dream. While embodiment and spatial reorientation are proceeding in the foreground, the dream state, still active in deeper regions of the brain, is gradually quieting. The vivid imagery, the emotional intensity, the internal logic of the dream are all losing their neural support as the brain reallocates resources toward waking functions. This is why the dream fades so quickly and so completely. It is not that the memory is lost in a conventional sense. It is that the neurological conditions that were generating the dream are actively being dismantled and redirected. Identity reconstruction is the next major layer. This is the process by which you become you again in the full, socially and historically continuous sense. Your name, your relationships, your ongoing concerns, your role in the world, the particular collection of memories and expectations that make you specifically yourself and no one else. All of this is assembled from long-term memory into the present moment of awareness. It happens so naturally that you almost never notice it. But it is happening every single morning. Time reorientation also occurs in this window. The sense of what time it is, what day it is, and where this particular morning falls in the sequence of your life is reconstructed from clues both internal and external. The level of light in the room, the sounds from outside, the feeling of your body and how rested or unrested it feels. These cues are integrated with memory to situate you in time. The dreaming brain has no stable time. Inside a dream, time moves in ways that are elastic, non-linear, and often impossible to measure. A dream can feel as though it lasted for hours and yet occupy only a few minutes of clock time, or it can compress what feels like years into a brief, vivid flash. The waking brain, by contrast, is deeply anchored to sequential time. The reassembly of your time sense is part of the transition from the dreaming mode, in which time is fluid and subjective, to the waking mode, in which time is structured, shared, and measurable. What is worth sitting with in all of this is the sheer complexity of what is happening in those few seconds or minutes. You are not simply regaining consciousness, you are being reconstructed from the most basic physical layer of embodied awareness up through space, identity, and time. Your brain is generating you. It is building the experience of being a particular person in a particular place at a particular moment. And it has done this so reliably for so many thousands of mornings of your life that the process itself has become invisible. But in the slow, gradual, unhurried waking from a deep and vivid dream, the layers of construction sometimes become just barely perceptible, not as separate stages, not as clinical steps, but as a kind of felt sense of the world being assembled around you. The room arriving, the self returning, the ordinary weight of being you settling back into place, and somewhere in the background, the last traces of wherever you were before all of this began. That sequence, from the dream, through the threshold, into the assembled world, is the mechanism that underlies every morning of your life. And what it reveals, if you observe it carefully, is that the waking world, however solid and undeniable it feels, is always in some sense a construction, a deeply reliable, deeply consistent, genuinely useful construction, but a construction nonetheless. At this point, it is worth being precise about what we actually know, what is genuinely supported by research, and what remains in the territory of interpretation and open question. This distinction matters not because wonder should be constrained by caution, but because honest wonder is more durable than wonder built on overstatement. What we know with confidence is this: The brain undergoes a genuine and measurable transition as it moves from sleep to waking. That transition involves changes in electrical activity, in neurochemistry, in the patterns of communication between different brain regions. The transition is not instantaneous, it is gradual and staged. And during the transitional window, the brain is in a partially mixed state, with elements of dreaming and waking cognition active simultaneously. What we also know is that the subjective experience of this transition is real. The hypnopompic state is not imaginary. The feelings of existing between two places, of carrying a fading world in your awareness, of being simultaneously inside a dissolving dream and a reassembling room, all of this reflects genuine neurological activity. It is not illusion in the sense of being empty. It is experience, rich and complex, arising from a brain in a particular transitional configuration. What becomes less certain is the interpretation of what these experiences mean. When the threshold feels like coming from somewhere, is that feeling an artifact of the brain's reconstruction process, a kind of temporal confusion generated by the mismatch between dream time and waking time? Or is it a genuine signal about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to different modes of experience? Science does not currently have a final answer to this question. The idea that consciousness might in some sense touch another reality during sleep is not a claim that mainstream neuroscience currently makes or endorses. There is no controlled experiment that has demonstrated the mind leaving ordinary physical reality during dreaming. There is no established mechanism by which dreaming consciousness could interact with a separate plane of existence. These are ideas that exist in the speculative space beyond the current boundary of science. And yet the boundary of science is not a fixed wall. It is a moving line, pushed forward by observation, experiment, and the willingness to ask questions that current frameworks cannot yet answer. Many phenomena that once seemed mysterious have eventually yielded to careful investigation. And some questions that seemed settled have turned out to be more complex upon closer examination. The honest position is this: the experience of the threshold is real. The science of the threshold is genuine but incomplete. The interpretation of the threshold as contact with another reality is speculative. And the question of what consciousness is, and whether it can be meaningfully said to travel or expand or touch different states of being, remains one of the most sincerely open questions in contemporary science and philosophy. Here is something worth pausing on. Something that the science of waking, taken as a whole, quietly reveals about the nature of your daily experience. The world you wake into every morning is not simply there, waiting for you, fully formed and independent of your mind. Your brain builds it. It builds it quickly, reliably, and with breathtaking consistency. But it builds it. The room you see when you open your eyes is the product of your brain interpreting sensory signals, applying stored models, generating predictions, and assembling an experience of coherent reality from raw data. This process is so fast and so accurate that it feels like pure perception. But it is also, in a precise neurological sense, construction. This means something remarkable. It means that every morning, your mind performs an act of world building. And every evening, when you fall asleep and the dream begins, your mind performs another act of world building. The difference between the two is enormous in many practical and meaningful ways. The waking world is shared, consistent, testable, navigable, and connected to a stable physical environment. The dreaming world is private, variable, and disconnected from that shared physical anchor. But the process is more similar than ordinary experience suggests. Both rely on the brain's extraordinary capacity to generate a coherent, immersive, emotionally real experience of existing somewhere. And the threshold between them, the moment right before you wake, is the moment when both constructions are briefly visible at once. That visibility is not confusion, though it can feel disorienting. It is, in its own way, a form of insight. The fading dream and the assembling room, experienced together in those first soft seconds of waking, offer a rare glimpse of what the mind is always doing but usually hides from you. They reveal the construction in the act of construction. This is the micro-revelation at the heart of the threshold experience. Not that you visited a literal alternate universe while you slept, but something in some ways more interesting, that the universe you return to each morning is itself, in part, a production of your awareness, that the world is not simply received, it is met, it is participated in, it is, in the most careful and accurate sense, co-constructed by the mind that perceives it. And if that is true of the waking world, then the waking world becomes a little more mysterious than it ordinarily appears. And the dream world, however strange and private, becomes a little more meaningful. Because both are expressions of what your mind does when it is doing what it does most fundamentally: making experience, making meaning, making a world to inhabit. Now we move into more openly speculative territory, not abandoning care, but carrying it into less charted space. Because there is a way of reading everything we have explored so far that opens into a genuinely fascinating possibility. Not a certainty, not a proven fact, but a possibility worth entering with curiosity and honesty. What if the liminal state, the threshold before waking, represents a moment in which consciousness is genuinely less bound than usual to the particular configuration we call ordinary reality? Not in the sense of traveling through a portal, not in the sense of quantum leaping to an alternate dimension, but in the sense of temporarily releasing the constraints that normally organize experience into the specific, stable, shared framework of waking life. Consider what those constraints actually are. The waking mind is anchored to sensory input from a specific physical body in a specific physical environment. It is anchored to a continuous identity narrative, the ongoing story of who you are, what has happened to you, and what you expect will happen next. It is anchored to sequential time, to linear logic, and to the social reality of a shared world. These anchors are not prisons. They are what make functional life possible, but they are constraints on the range of experience. During dreaming, most of those constraints are removed. The body is not sending reliable sensory data. Identity is flexible and sometimes unmoored from waking continuity. Time is fluid. Logic is associative rather than linear. The result is a mode of consciousness that, while still obviously generated by the same brain, has a profoundly different shape. Different access to image, emotion, metaphor, and possibility. Different freedom from the ordinary filters. At the threshold before waking, you are in a state where the waking constraints are only partially reimposed. The dream constraints have not yet fully released. What you have for a brief time is a form of awareness that is partially anchored and partially free. And some researchers in the areas of consciousness studies and contemplative science have suggested that this partially free state may allow the mind access to patterns, feelings, insights, and perceptions that the fully constrained waking mind does not ordinarily encounter. This is not the same as saying consciousness leaves the body or visits another universe. It is a more modest and more interesting claim that the range of what the mind can perceive and generate and feel may be genuinely wider in the threshold than at other times, that the loosened constraints are not just absence but possibility, that the dissolution of ordinary mental organization may create space for something that the organized waking mind cannot produce on its own. Some artists and writers and scientists have historically reported their most unexpected insights arising in precisely this state, in the slow drift toward sleep or in the gradual rise from it. The mathematician Henri Poincaré wrote about insights arriving in states of relaxed, unfocused awareness. Thomas Edison was said to use a technique of sitting with metal balls in his hands as he drifted into sleep, so that the sound of them falling when he lost muscle control would wake him at the threshold and allow him to capture whatever his mind had accessed there. Whether the details of these accounts are entirely accurate matters less than what they point to. A widespread intuition across cultures and disciplines that the threshold is not empty. If the speculative model is even partly right, it would suggest that what you experience right before waking is not a malfunction or a residue or a noise in the signal. It would suggest that it is a genuine, if brief and personal, encounter with a wider field of consciousness, one that your ordinary waking mind can touch but cannot sustain, can sense but cannot fully contain. If the liminal threshold is a place where consciousness is partially freed from its ordinary constraints, then the implications for how you understand your own mind become quietly profound, not in a way that requires you to accept any particular metaphysical position, but in a way that invites a different quality of attention to experiences you may have been dismissing as neurological noise. The emotional residue that follows a powerful dream, the feeling that persists after the imagery has dissolved, might be worth taking more seriously. If the threshold allows the mind access to something it cannot reach during ordinary waking, then the emotions that survive the crossing, even after the content that generated them is gone, may carry genuine signal. They may be telling you something about your inner life that the structured waking mind cannot say directly. The sense of recognition that sometimes accompanies dream imagery, the feeling of knowing a place or a person or a situation that has no equivalent in your waking life, might also be worth sitting with differently. It may arise from associative neural processes that connect fragments of memory and imagination in ways that the waking mind does not normally allow. But the feeling of recognition, however it is generated, is pointing towards something in your mental architecture that is worth acknowledging. What it would mean for your mind is this. Your mind is not a simple single-mode processor that runs one program at a time. It is a complex, layered, parallel system that operates in many different configurations. The waking mode is the one you know best because it is the one you spend most of your time in. But it is not the only mode. And the other modes, particularly the dreaming mode and the liminal threshold mode, are not lesser or broken versions of waking consciousness. They are different expressions of the same system, with different capabilities and different kinds of access. Dreams may be doing work that waking thought cannot do, processing emotion at a depth that the defended waking mind resists, making connections between ideas that logical thinking keeps separate, rehearsing emotional responses to situations that have not yet occurred. integrating experiences that were too large or too painful to be fully assimilated during waking. The threshold may be the moment when some of that deeper work surfaces, briefly, into a form that your waking consciousness can almost but not quite hold. The experience of the threshold may also be related to what some researchers call insight, the sudden sense of understanding that arrives when you are not directly thinking about a problem. Insight is known to involve the deactivation of certain attentive, focused brain networks and the activation of broader, more associative ones. The threshold state, in which the focused waking networks are only beginning to reassemble, may offer a window during which insight-like connections are unusually accessible. This would mean that the moments right before you wake are not merely transitional. They may be among the most creatively and emotionally rich moments of your day. The problem you have been unable to solve, the feeling you have been unable to name, the memory you have been unable to integrate, may be closer to resolution in those soft, half-formed moments than at any other time. If that is true, then what you do with those moments, whether you rush through them toward the alarm in the schedule, or whether you allow them a few extra seconds of quiet attention, matters in a way you may not have previously considered. It is worth being fair to the skeptical view. And the skeptical view, honestly held, has genuine force. The experiences of the hypnopompic threshold, however subjectively powerful, can be accounted for by known neurological processes without requiring any appeal to consciousness being freed or expanded or touching anything outside the brain. The feeling of having been somewhere, of returning rather than resuming, may simply be a product of how the brain manages the transition between dream mode and wake mode. When the neural systems that were generating the dream begin to quiet, and the systems that generate the sense of continuous identity begin to reactivate, there is a brief mismatch. The brain has been running one very convincing reality simulation and is now switching to another. The subjective experience of that switching process might naturally feel like a journey between two places, even if no actual journey occurred. The emotional residue of dreams, the feeling of meaningfulness that sometimes clings to them after the imagery is gone, might be equally explained by the fact that dreaming involves deep limbic activation, the kind of emotional processing that leaves a biochemical trace that persists after the neural patterns generating it have dissolved. You feel something because your brain was genuinely in a heightened emotional state. The feeling is real. The meaningfulness may be a story imposed afterward. The sense of insight arising at the threshold might be a version of what cognitive scientists call incubation, a process in which background processing, ongoing below the level of conscious attention, produces connections that surface when the focused, attentive mind relaxes. This is a real phenomenon, but it does not require a special consciousness state. It requires only that the focusing system be briefly offline, which sleep and the waking transition naturally provide. Reasonable skeptics would argue that the threshold experiences, however vivid and however meaningful they feel, are neurological transitions and memory artifacts. That what you are experiencing is your brain switching between modes, and that the specific quality of that switching experience, the sense of two worlds, the feeling of return, the emotional richness, is determined by the particular way human brains happen to manage this transition. Moving and interesting, yes. Evidence of consciousness touching another reality, no. This is a coherent and defensible position, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it fully. The experiences of the threshold do not prove anything beyond the extraordinary complexity of the human brain in transition. And yet, even if the skeptical account is entirely correct, there is still a revelation hiding inside it. Because if the experiences of the threshold are purely neurological, then what they reveal is how reality is assembled each morning. And that revelation is not smaller than the speculative one. In some ways, it is more profound. If the feeling of returning from somewhere is generated by the brain's mode-switching process, then what that tells you is that the waking world is, in a real and meaningful sense, the product of your brain's assembly process. You do not simply wake into a reality that was waiting for you. Your brain generates the conditions for your experience of reality each morning, rebuilding the context, the identity, the sensory world, and the temporal framework that make ordinary life possible. This means that the experience of waking up, taken seriously and observed carefully, is a window into the creative power of the mind. Every morning, without effort and without your conscious direction, your brain constructs a world. It does this from scratch, or close to it, after hours during which the ordinary world was largely suspended. And it does it reliably enough that you never doubt the result. If you can hold that awareness even briefly in the gentle moments before the alarm or the morning pulls you fully back into ordinary life, something quietly shifts. The world you step into does not change. The room is still the room. The day is still the day. But the sense of the mind's participation in making that world real becomes, for a moment, perceptible. And a world you consciously participate in constructing, even if only in the sense of meeting it with an active and assembling awareness, is a world that feels slightly more alive than one you simply receive. The threshold, whether it is a portal to elsewhere or simply a seam between modes of being, offers the same basic gift either way. It shows you that the boundary between where you were and where you are is not fixed and hard and cold. It is soft, it is gradual, it is participated in by your own awareness. And that softness, that gradual return, that active participation in the construction of your own experience is something worth noticing every single morning for the rest of your life. Let us return to the beginning, to the moment we started with. You are lying in a dark room. The dream is fading. The world is beginning to assemble around you, piece by careful piece, returning in the particular order that your brain always uses to rebuild the experience of being you. The ceiling, the light, the weight of the body, the name, the day. And somewhere in the space just before all of that is complete, you are suspended. Awareness without a full address, consciousness without its usual complete architecture, present but not yet fully located in the ordinary world. And what you are holding in that moment, the last texture of the dream, the first signal of the waking room, is not nothing. It is not neurological static. It is experience, genuine and irreducible, arising in the boundary between two different ways your mind has been in the world. That boundary crossing happens every single morning. In fact, it happens multiple times a night during the briefer transitions between sleep cycles, though you are rarely aware of those. The major crossing, the final return from the deepest and most recent dreaming into full waking consciousness, is the one you occasionally sense, and what you sense there is something real about the architecture of your own mind. The reframe is this: the moment before waking is not a malfunction. It is not confusion in a pejorative sense. It is not your brain failing to maintain a clean boundary between sleep and awareness. It is the natural and genuine experience of a mind that has been doing profound and complex work during the night, now making its return to the particular mode of existence we call ordinary life. And the crossing is gradual, because the return is a reconstruction. And the reconstruction is extraordinary. When the dream world and the waking world briefly overlap in your awareness, what you are experiencing is a kind of double exposure. Both images visible at once, neither fully in focus, both real in the sense that both are being generated by genuine neural activity and genuine conscious awareness. The dream reality was real for your mind while you were in it. The waking reality is real for your mind now that you are returning to it. And the threshold is the moment when real meets real in the most intimate space possible, inside your own consciousness. The sense of loss that sometimes accompanies this crossing, the quiet wistfulness of watching the dream world recede, is not irrational. Something was there. Not in the physical world, not in the sense that you could have taken a photograph of it, but in the sense that your consciousness was fully inhabiting it, was fully experiencing it, was fully present to it in the only way that consciousness is ever present to anything, from the inside. Losing access to that world, even if it was a private and temporary construction, is a genuine change in your experience. And the sense of wonder that can sometimes accompany waking, particularly after a dream of unusual vividness and beauty, is also not irrational. It is the appropriate response of a mind that has glimpsed, however briefly, just how extraordinary its own range actually is. The waking self is remarkable. The dreaming self is remarkable. The fact that they are in some sense the same self, navigating radically different modes of experience, is perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. What changes when you reframe the threshold in this way is the quality of attention you might bring to it. Instead of rushing through those first soft moments of waking as quickly as possible, eager to check the time or the phone or the day's obligations, you might pause, just for a few seconds, not to analyze or to document, just to notice, to feel the two worlds briefly together, to let the crossing be what it actually is, an extraordinary event happening quietly in an ordinary bedroom every single morning of your life. Expand the lens now, not all the way to infinity, but wide enough to hold the full sweep of what we've been exploring. Your consciousness, the awareness that is reading these words or hearing this voice in the quiet of whatever hour it is for you right now, is not a static thing. It is a dynamic, shifting, state-dependent phenomenon. It moves, it changes. It takes different forms in different conditions, and each of those forms has its own quality, its own capabilities, its own relationship to experience. During ordinary waking hours, your consciousness is tightly organized. It is focused, sequential, self-referential, anchored to a body in a space in a time. It is useful, navigational, socially tuned. It is the instrument you use to get through the world, to connect with others, to make decisions and remember the past and anticipate the future. It is invaluable, and it is one configuration among several that your mind is capable of. During dreaming, your consciousness reorganizes into a different configuration. The anchors loosen, the filters relax. The sequential logic gives way to associative flow. The identity becomes fluid and sometimes multiple. The world the mind generates is private, intensely personal, emotionally uninhibited, and freed from the constraints of shared physical reality. It is not less than waking consciousness, it is differently arranged. And in the threshold between these two configurations, consciousness is in transition. It is between forms. And what that suggests, if you take it seriously, is that consciousness is not a fixed thing with fixed properties. It is something more like a field that can be organized in different ways, that can take different shapes depending on the conditions, that can support different kinds of experience depending on its current configuration. The waking self and the dreaming self are not two separate entities. They are two arrangements of the same underlying awareness. This idea is not foreign to the history of human thought. Many philosophical traditions, from certain schools of Indian philosophy to aspects of Western phenomenology, have explored the notion that consciousness is more fundamental and more multiform than ordinary assumptions suggest. That what we call the self is not a fixed object, but a process, a dynamic pattern of awareness that stabilizes into particular configurations and can also, under certain conditions, loosen those configurations and become something wider. What science currently knows about consciousness does not confirm this view, but it also does not refute it. The hard problem of consciousness remains genuinely unsolved. We do not know why neural activity gives rise to subjective experience. We do not know whether consciousness is entirely generated by the brain, or whether the brain is better understood as an instrument that localizes or organizes something more fundamental. These questions are not settled. They are open, and the wisest position is to sit with that openness rather than to force it closed in either direction. What the threshold tells us, if it tells us anything beyond its neurological mechanics, is that whatever consciousness is, it is capable of a range of experience that ordinary waking life only partially reveals. The universe of your experience is larger than the waking day. The self that exists across all of your states, dreaming, hypnopompic, waking, and all the variations in between, is more capacious than the self you know from the daytime hours alone. And if your individual consciousness is that capacious, then the nature of consciousness in general. The broader question of what awareness is and how it fits into the structure of the universe becomes a question of extraordinary scale and extraordinary wonder. A question that science is beginning to take seriously in ways it did not a generation ago. And a question that begins for each of us in the most intimate place possible, in the quiet, dark moments right before the room comes back. Whatever you believe about the nature of the threshold, whatever your position on consciousness and dreams and the possibility of touching something beyond ordinary reality, whatever level of skepticism or openness you carry into these questions, there is something here that belongs simply to the experience of being human, and it deserves a moment of quiet acknowledgement. You have been crossing that threshold every night of your life. Since the first days of your existence, long before you had language for it or concepts to organize it, you have been moving between the world of waking and the world of dreaming and back again. You have been making that return, night after night, year after year. And the fact that the crossing has become so familiar, so seamlessly integrated into the rhythm of life, does not make it less extraordinary. It makes it more so. The threshold is not a place of danger. Whatever the hypnopompic state involves, whatever its mechanisms and its mysteries, it is a place your mind has always known how to navigate. You have never failed to return. The waking world has always reassembled. Your identity has always reconstituted itself, gently and completely, from whatever the dream has left in its place. Your mind knows this crossing deeply. It has done it thousands of times. There is something comforting in that knowledge. The strangeness of the threshold is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is real and complex and worth noticing. The disorientation of those first few waking seconds is not a flaw in the system. It is evidence of the depth and richness of the system, evidence of just how fully your consciousness inhabits its sleep states, evidence of how genuinely far from ordinary awareness the dreaming mind actually travels. And the emotional residue of powerful dreams, the feelings that persist after the imagery is gone, is not a malfunction of memory. It is perhaps the most honest message that the dreaming mind sends to the waking one. The content, the story, the imagery of the dream may be lost, but the emotional intelligence of the dreaming mind, its capacity to feel things purely and directly, without the defenses and complications of waking cognition, sometimes leaves its mark. And those marks are worth taking seriously. You are not alone in any of this. Every person who has ever lived has had the experience of waking slowly from a dream and feeling suspended between two places. Every curious mind, every quiet late-night listener, every person who has ever lain in the dark and wondered what the dream was trying to say, has been at the same threshold you have stood at. The experience is profoundly personal and profoundly universal at the same time. The threshold is not something to be afraid of or anxious about. It is something to be curious about, something to be quietly amazed by, something to bring a little more attention to tomorrow morning when the room begins to assemble around you again, and the last wisp of wherever you were begins to fade, and the world comes back to meet you, as it always has, and always will. We have traveled a long way together tonight. From the first fragile moment of a threshold between sleeping and waking, through the neuroscience of what the brain does in those final seconds before consciousness assembles the day, through the speculative edge of what that transitional state might mean, and into the existential landscape of a consciousness that moves every night of its life between realities, between worlds, between versions of itself. And now we want to hear from you. Tonight, or tomorrow morning, or the next time you wake slowly and feel that particular suspension between the dream and the room, we want you to notice something. Notice how it feels. Notice whether you feel like you are returning from somewhere. Notice whether the dream left a feeling behind even after the imagery is gone. Notice whether the room assembles in stages or arrives all at once or feels for just a moment unfamiliar and new. And then come back here and tell us about it. Tell us about the dream you have had that felt like another life. Tell us about the moment before waking when you were in a place that felt completely real and deeply known and yet had no address in the waking world. Tell us about the threshold as you have experienced it, in your own words, in whatever detail you feel moved to share. This comment section is a place for exactly that kind of quiet, curious, honest sharing. Your experience at the threshold is not trivial. It is not neurological noise. It is a genuine encounter with one of the most mysterious and most intimate processes that your consciousness performs. It is worth describing. And the community that gathers here in the quiet hours, curious and open and unafraid of the mystery, is the perfect place to share it. Tomorrow morning, something is going to happen that has happened every morning of your life. Before the alarm, if one is set or in the natural gentleness of a morning without obligation, your consciousness is going to begin its return. The dream will be running its final scenes. Your body will send its first signals: weight, warmth, the particular feeling of the bed beneath you. The room will begin to arrive. And in the space between those two events, in the few seconds when the dream is still present and the room is only beginning, you will be at the threshold. Not a metaphorical threshold. The actual place this entire exploration has been about. The real, lived, neurologically documented, philosophically mysterious, personally intimate crossing point between your sleeping self and your waking one. Tomorrow morning, perhaps you will notice it differently. Perhaps you will feel the dream releasing its hold with a little more attention than usual. Perhaps you will feel the room assembling, the walls finding their positions, the light taking its shape, the ceiling solidifying softly above you, and you will know, in a way you did not know before, what your brain is actually doing in those seconds. You will feel the construction in the act of construction. And perhaps in the last wisp of wherever your dreams took you tonight, you will feel something familiar. Some place or emotion or presence that your waking mind cannot name, but your dreaming mind knew completely. And you will understand, not as an abstraction, but as a lived reality, why that final moment before waking can feel like standing at the edge of two worlds. That edge is not a place to be afraid of. It is a place to be present to. The dream world that is releasing you made you feel things that your waking mind rarely allows. The waking world that is receiving you is stranger and more actively constructed than it ordinarily appears. And you, moving between them, are something more capacious and more mysterious than the ordinary daytime self ever fully reveals. The threshold has been there your entire life. It has been waiting every morning for you to notice it, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with the quiet patience of something that knows you will return to it again tonight, and the night after, and all the nights that follow. It has always been there. It will always be there. Just before you wake, just before the world assembles itself around you again. And perhaps that is the most beautiful thing that this exploration leaves behind. Not a proven theory, not a definitive answer to the deepest questions about consciousness and reality, but a new quality of attention for tomorrow morning. A slightly softer, slightly slower, slightly more curious way of crossing from sleep to waking, of noticing the room arrive, of feeling the self return, of standing just for a moment at the threshold, present to both worlds, belonging briefly and beautifully to neither, and then, gently, coming home.